into Amazing Spider-Man number 11 and number 12. Number 11 was written by, well, both of these issues written by Dan Slott. I don't think we're going to be varying here. This whole series is written by Dan Slott, so I'll just cover my butt right now. But the art's going to change. So we got art by Olivier Coipel on Amazing Spider-Man number 11, and then number 12, Giuseppe Camuncoli. All right, I'm just going to say my Appalachian may have messed that up, but
that works.
All right, Giuseppe or Giuseppe?
That synopsis is coming up, but first let me talk about Amazon Music. If you're looking for a good platform that can fill those musical needs, Amazon Music has you covered. If you head to getamazonmusic.com/W2M Network, you can get a free 30-day trial where you can check out over 70 million songs. That's getamazonmusic.com/W2M Network for that free 30-day trial.
On Earth 13, that's right, that's the refuge Earth, Peter Parker and the Superior Spider-Man square off with Pete able to win the fight. Trying to figure out what their next move will be, Pete gives Miles Morales and the Ultimate Spider-Man from the cartoon universe dimension-hopping tech and tasks them with recruiting more spiders to help their cause. Peter takes a few friends with him in order to do the same thing and leaves the group under the leadership of Spider UK until he gets back. During this time, we learn of the inheritor Karn, an outcast from his family who is crusading across universes, reluctantly killing spiders, hoping to gain favor from his family so that he may ultimately return home and be accepted. We also learn of the father of the inheritors, a powerful patriarch by the name of Solus, who gathers his sons, Morlun and Genix, to face off with the army of spiders on Earth 13. He's like, let's go, boys. We're doing this. When the battle commences, the cosmic Spider-Man of that Earth aims to protect the rest of the army, but is taken by surprise when Solus absorbs the Enigma Force and kills him. Morlun is then able to escape with another key to the prophecy, the Scion, a young boy named Benji, or Benny, who also happens to be the younger brother of, is it Spider-Woman or Spider-Girl?
At this point in time, it's Spider-Girl.
Spider-Girl, okay. I put Spider-Woman there for some reason, but it's Mayday Parker's younger brother, Benny, or Benji. Peter and Mary Jane's daughter from another universe. It's Peter and Mary Jane, right? Yep. They got married? Okay, all right. So Peter and Mary Jane's daughter from another universe. When Pete gets word that Earth 13 is under attack, he brings in a few recruits, specifically, now you're going to have to tell me if this has had a previous appearance, a spider from Japan that is piloting a large robot mech named Leopardon.
If I can find the YouTube video, I'll bring it up. I don't remember exactly when, but there was a Spider-Man series, like Marvel licensed a company in Japan to make their own Spider-Man series. Basically, they just allowed, to the best of my knowledge, they basically just allowed them to use the costume and to use the name Spider-Man, and then they just let them run with it. And it ended up being like Kamen Rider, Power Rangers, Ultraman type, the usual fare, like, what was popular in Japan at the time, what's, still popular in Japan, which is, superheroes that fight giant monsters in giant mech suits.
That is spectacular.
It is a thing. It existed. I'm positive there are clips on YouTube. I will be happy to share them with you. They're pretty great. Not something I would normally get into, but it's part of Spider-Man lore, and I will not deny it. You'd notice a little bit of like Power Rangers and Ultraman. Before you get into the mech suit, there's always the scenes where he's fighting like, goons. Mm-hmm. They had the benefit of like, the guy that they got to play to at least do the fighting work in Spider-Man was a pretty sweet, like decent martial artist, and he was doing like some cool shit as Spider-Man. He was, like leaping up and down construction sites, and he was doing kung fu, and it was pretty cool. Like, if I'm thinking of the same series, it was of its time. Like, if you've ever seen like, Ultraman back in the day, like it was like that.
That's cool.
If you're into that sort of thing, which I am, then it's pretty entertaining. If not, then it's not for you. And I had
a feeling it existed.
Dan Slott was on Twitter as he was writing these parts, showing people the art on Twitter, saying, "Can you believe I actually get to put this in a comic?" I remember that. Even he couldn't believe it. He was like, you believe this?
It's happening. So Leopardon shows up. Now we've got a fight on our hands between Solus and Leopardon, and they're engaging in battle while the rest of the team try to find a way to escape. Luckily, during her retreat, Silk has found a world. She's hopping different universes trying to keep, I think it's Bora and Bricks off her tail. They're following her. So she lands in this world that the inheritors will not enter. Unfortunately, it happens to be irradiated by a nuclear holocaust. However, Silk has found a bunker and she gets Pete the coordinates. And when Pete and the rest of the spiders arrive and get to the bunker, they are greeted by that world's spider, Uncle Ben. Ooh, what a way to end that. Now, real quick, before we hop into other things, I did want to catch up on the adventures of some of the other spiders here, and we kind of already talked about them. Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman, has found herself in the Inheritors reality, which is called Loom World, where she has met the Master Weaver. Remember, that's the guy that's opening up all these portals for the Inheritors. The Master Weaver gives her these scrolls that are important to the events that are unfolding, and Jessica only has enough juice left in her teleporter to send these scrolls over to Pete. Jessica Drew is now stranded on Loom World. Miles and were they calling themselves the Web Warriors? Is that what it was called?
That's kind of an inside joke because that was the subtitle of one of the Ultimate Spider-Man series that came out on Disney XD.
Nice. Okay.
It was the whole season was called Web Warriors because
fantastic.
Because it featured a little bit like Spider-Verse. It featured alternate universe Spider-Man.
That's
Spider
great.
people.
Miles and we got the Ultimate cartoon Spider-Man there. We have they have went and they've recruited I think pretty much a bunch of spiders that are at least somehow associated with the animated universe of.
But in particular, they dedicated a whole half of Spider-Verse team up to this.
Yes.
Where they go into the 1967 original Spider-Man cartoon universe.
Oh my goodness, that was a great issue.
I love that despite myself. I'm not a huge I do very much like the original 67 Spider-Man series.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. There are other Spider-Man series. There are other Spider-Man animated shows that I like way more. But game recognizes game. That was the original one. They used Steve Ditko's artwork.
Oh,
I cannot hate on that series.
Oh, man.
It was what it was. At the time, it was probably the coolest shit that any Spider-Man fan had ever seen. And it's iconic. There's 100 and something episodes of that series. And, if you grew up with it, this issue and this particular interaction was made for you.
Yeah, if you think the threat of the Sinister Six is frightening, wow, wait till you hear about Noah Body. Noah Body. Oh, yeah. Man. It was good, man. I really did enjoy that. And
this is also where you recognize, for all the flaws with this series, and there's a lot of flaws with this series, objectively speaking, there is flaws out the ass with this whole Spider-Verse thing. but this series came from such a place of love and admiration and, nostalgia. Some of the nostalgia was misplaced, but when it's something like this that's obviously done with so much affection,
yeah,
it almost makes it criticism proof. Not entirely, but it's because this Spider-Verse team up, that little side story, it had very little, if any, effect or importance to the main story.
Mm-hmm.
But it was fun. It was cool.
Exactly.
It was so much fun. If you're reading these in the order of the checklist, it's actually kind of a nice breakup of the sort of relentless spider people getting smacked up one universe and down another.
Yeah,
I can appreciate it on those terms. Dan Slott also said this whole series is going to have something for literally everybody. Generation of Spider-Man fan that has ever lived.
Yeah,
it's going to have something for the cats that grew up in the 60s. It's going to have for 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Mm-hmm. Everybody. It had, and in this issue, you see, it's the Spider-Man of 1967, animated series meeting up with the Spider-Man of 2017 animated series. Mm-hmm. Several decades later. They take the piss out of both of them. They poke fun at the quirks of both series.
Yep.
There's a little thing at the end where Miles Morales unmasks and Ultimate Spider-Man is is Mad Men Spider-Man also like is he the bad parts of the 60s too?
Yeah.
There's a time and a place to explore that. This was not the time and the place to explore that. So I'm glad
I think they sidestepped it. I mean, when he took it, they didn't say sidestep, but it wasn't there. The racial tension, because I think, what does he say? He says he pulls the mask off.
You're a high school you're high school student. I'm like,
exactly.
Nice save.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, again, you're right. It's a respite from what we're getting, and I liked what you were talking about there with Dan Slott. He's trying to give something to everybody, and man, could you imagine just being a creator? You're at the head of writing Spider-Man, and someone lays at your feet and says, "Here you go. This is what we'd like for you to do." Now, I don't know where the pitch came in. I don't know if Dan Slott came up with this, which I'm sure it came from his head. But regardless,
he has like Christos Gage is his like co-writer, his sometimes co-writer, who wrote a few issues of a few of the side stories and a few of the sort of tie-in books.
Yeah.
So I think between the two of them, I think they conceived of a lot of this, and yeah.
Well, and so you've got a lot on your plate at that point. You've got to try and write a cohesive story while trying to please everybody, or at least give it a little nod to everybody that would be interested in it. And you don't want to leave anything off the table. 67 Spider-Man is an obvious thing that you need to go back and grab and make part of the story somehow. And you better not kill him off. You're going to make some people mad. But yeah, so watching Miles go through, and those were some of the fun stories. Then in the 2099 reality, Miguel O'Hara, the Spider-Man of 2099, still has his hands full trying to discover any information they can on the Inheritors, but he's been able to capture Deimos in an inescapable prison. So he's put him in this prison, and Deimos can't get out of it until Deimos kills himself and immediately enters a clone body. So we have that going on over in the 2099 universe. And of course, we mentioned it before, the Scarlet Spider's Parker clones, Ben, Jessica, and Kane, had a battle with the Inheritor Genix at his main clone facility. In the end, they were able to destroy the tech they used to transfer their essence into other clones. So that pretty much ends the aspect of the Inheritors almost being immortal.
Okay.
Pretty much. So that ends that. But in order to do that, we have some consequences. Ben Reilly was caught in an explosion and apparently died. So I'm going to give you a few minutes.
Here's where we have to start talking about clones, which was the thing I was not expecting to have to talk about with this series.
Mm-hmm.
This is why Scarlet Spiders in particular, and some of the stuff that happens in Spider-Man 2099 needed to be part of the main story, because if you didn't read those, you have no idea whatsoever about any aspects of any of the clone stuff, which is a big, important part of this story. It explains a lot. It not only explains a lot in this story, it explains a lot in previous stories. It explains why Moreland came back 3 times. Because what happens in the story, like to clarify, is one of the Inheritor brothers named Genix actually controls basically an entire alternate dimension that he has populated with nothing but, all of these different facilities where all he's doing is growing clones of him and his siblings. And he's developed a technology where if one of them dies, their consciousness immediately gets transferred to a different clone. So it gives them the appearance of being immortal, which virtually they are. Every time they die, they just their mind just gets transferred to another body and they just pick up where they left off. That issue of Spider-Man 2099 where they actually imprison Deimos in Alchemex, which is the big bad evil corporation in the 2099 universe. Peter David wrote the 2099 issues. Peter David created Spider-Man 2099, legendary comic book writer, did not, for my liking, get nearly enough time writing Spider-Man as he should have. He's hit and miss with some other things. I know there's some other stories that he's written that were not that great, but he's always been pretty good on Spider-Man, and 2099 is beloved. Kind of escapes a lot of the criticism that a lot of people had of the 2099 universe because it was the only good one. It was the only really good one. Mm-hmm. The other ones ranged from okay to crap, but Spider-Man 2099 was consistently considered the best of the best, and it was good even of its time in the 90s because it was Peter David writing, like off-the-wall sci-fi that just happened to have Spider-Man in it, And when you got that combination of writer, concept, character, you can't lose. That's, Spider-Man 2099 was much beloved for that reason. It was Peter David in his element. So he's doing all these 2099 issues, which end up being very important to Spider-Verse. I figured out what was going to happen with Deimos when they imprisoned him pretty early on. As soon as they let the cat out of the bag that the Inheritors were using clones.
You had one up on me. I thought something crazy was going to happen. I didn't realize. I was like, well, shoot, he does have an easy way out. Why didn't I see it coming?
Yeah, because there's one page where they really like make it obvious. I don't know if they made it as obvious, they meant to make it as obvious as they did make it. But Miguel straight up says the force field in the prison that's keeping him in prison. He tells him, it'll kill you before you break out. And then Deimos just says, "Oh, is that a fact?" I'm like, "Oh, okay, he's gonna kill himself." I think Peter David kind of wrote that to be, that if you were really lingering on that, you might pick it up. So I was like, "Oh yeah, he's gonna kill himself, and then a clone's gonna come, just gonna come running right after him." This made for a great opportunity to cram Punisher 2099.
Oh yeah,
mix, I'm sure you were enjoying that.
Oh, I love to see it. It was
he lit him on fire, man. That was pretty great.
Too, dude. He's like when he lit him on fire, he was hot enough to melt through the building.
It's been like napalm or something. That was warm. Like napalm or something like that. There were some
Jake Gallows. Good to see him there.
Some of Doc Brown's chemically treated Presto logs and the flamethrower or something. I don't know.
Perfect.
The funny thing is that they don't find out a whole lot from dissecting, the dead Deimos that Doc Ock Spidey had killed earlier. They literally dragged his carcass to 2099 just to find out that the Inheritors are vulnerable to radiation, which is something that we all knew pretty early on anyway. I mean, maybe not if you hadn't read the previous stories. I gotta keep remembering, this is, if you come in cold and you haven't read a whole lot of anything else, you wouldn't know that. But that was a gigantic plot point in Coming Home in the original Moreland story. Was the reason you mentioned the alternate Earth that's completely irradiated, which, by the way, why it became irradiated, I love the reveal of that, and I'm sure you'll talk about that in a minute. We in Coming Home and Amazing Spider-Man in 2001, Peter kind of slowly discovers that Moreland notices, by trying to feed on Peter, that something is not quite right about his sort of energy that he gives off and his life energy that he gives off, which is what the Inheritors feed off of. It occurs to him the only thing that might be different or might be harmful is that, the spider that bit him was radioactive. There's a big to-do made in that story about, Ezekiel poses the question to Peter. He poses the question. It was a huge question that it wasn't answered directly, but he asks him at the beginning of that story arc, did the radiation cause your powers, or did the spider already have the power to give to you, and the radiation just killed it? They don't answer that question directly, and I think that was a good idea because it leaves it open to interpretation. It leaves it open to whatever. It also leaves it open to Peter to discover that Moreland, and later on find out all the rest of the Inheritors are that's their one weakness. They're vulnerable to radiation. To beat Moreland in that story, he had to inject himself with a radioactive compound that almost kills him. Then when Moreland tries to feed on him, it overloads his body and he can't handle it. He tries to run away from Peter, and Peter's like, "Oh no, now you're gonna take your medicine," and he kicks his ass up, up
nice.
Down, all over the place. It's great. I can't recommend that story enough, by the way. It's great.
All right.
It's J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr. It was their first arc. It was basically Spider-Man's comeback party after a very long time of being written like shit. Can't recommend it enough. It was the start of a lot of great things, the start of a lot of terrible things. That first 3 years of JMS and John Romita Jr. was one of my favorite periods of Spider-Man. And Ultimate Spider-Man was going on at the exact same time, so that was a really good time to be a Spider-Man fan. I was getting 2 kick-ass Spider-Man books, at least 2 a month. Anyway, so we find out, the Inheritors are vulnerable to radiation. We find out in Scarlet Spider discovers that they're utilizing clones. Ben Reilly makes his ultimate sacrifice. I thought that was an awesome way for Ben Reilly in particular to go out.
Yes.
They had portrayed him as an optimistic character, basically like traps Genix on the roof of the building and then just blows up the entire top of the building. Because Genix tries to say, like, you know, I've got clone facilities all over the world. You know, even if you destroy this place, you know, you're not going to do anything. I've still got clones everywhere. And they call his bluff and they say, that may be true, but I bet you this is the only building that has the technology to link your consciousness to all the other clones. So if we blow this place up, you have no connection to any of the other clone buildings. And he's like, And then Ben Reilly blows up the entire building, sacrifices himself, but that was a hell of a way to go out, man. That was pretty great. The reason why I think, you know, Scarlet Spiders needed to be not a side series. That
it's the catalyst for Kane too. Like that is the catalyst that puts Kane over the edge. Who's throughout most of that book he's just struggling to keep his rage.
Yeah, he's hanging by a thread as it is, because they go after him pretty early in the story, and he's already kind of a tortured character anyway. You know, he's a clone. He knows he's a clone. He's been through a lot of crap in previous stories. Mm-hmm. So he's always been kind of off. And the stuff that he goes through with the other clones, with Ben Reilly and with Ultimate Universe Jessica Drew, it's a good arc, man. Like that's like Scarlet Spiders actually surprised me with how good it was. It was a good character arc for all three of these characters that probably deserved more focus as part of the main story. Like, I'm going to keep beating that drum, but it's true.
I will go ahead and throw out here a couple things. I dug the Outcast Karn. Again, my first introduction to any of these characters, the Inheritors that is, and seeing Karn go out there who's just kind of like this guy who's, granted, he's killing spiders across these universes, but you could tell he just doesn't want to do that, but he's been shunned by his family, and he's like, the only way I can get back is just to show them that I can do what they're doing. Maybe they'll bring me back in.
If I could throw this out here, I kind of saw a parallel. I kind of saw like a similarity between like what's going on with Karn's story and what's going on with Octavius' story.
Okay.
In that they're both kind of people that have done a lot of horrible things that are trying to kind of redeem themselves without really knowing how.
Yeah.
They didn't lean into that as much as they could have. That could have been a much bigger deal in the story. You know, the later issues and the later tie-ins kind of start focusing a little bit more on Karn and his redemption, and that becomes a big plot point towards the end of the story. They mention like later on, like, you know, you can try to get your family's approval all you want, even if you reach the point where they accept you again, they're still gonna laugh at you behind their back.
Yeah.
And do you want that?
And that just makes the Inheritors that much more of a shitbag. They just like, okay, well, don't bring him home yet. What's Karn doing today? Where's he at now? And they just kind of like look at him and they're like, okay, send him over to here. So I assume that they're just in charge of the portals and just have him going from, and they're in charge of bringing him back. He has no control over that. But yeah, it makes the Inheritors that much more of a villain.
They can't even treat their own with any kind of dignity to, you know, once they fall out of favor, you know.
And I will tell you, one of the most upsetting parts of these two issues for me was Cosmic Spider-Man not like getting too many shots in on Solus before getting killed. I wanted a bigger battle than what we got.
It was a pretty big battle, but yeah, it could have gone. It could have gone longer than it did. You know, that's a common criticism of Slott, is that he, compared to how stories are told in comics these days, everything is decompressed for like six issues or more. He's not that guy. He tends to write much faster paced stories.
That really sets Solus up to be a complete badass.
Yeah, that was the goal, man. That was like, we got to establish this guy is like the baddest character in the story for what comes next in particular. Yeah,
for sure.
In part 3, we get our Spider-Man versus Superior Spider-Man fight.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. Coipel is still drawing the book at the story at this time, so it's a pretty cool battle. the other thread as far as like Superior Spider-Man is, and this is true in Spider-Verse and it's true in Superior Spider-Man, you know, the series that ran for about 2 years, is that Octavius, you know, is unquestionably a genius and he is unquestionably like one of the greatest minds in the Marvel universe, but he's just such an arrogant prick that it just screws him over every time.
Yeah.
Like, that's what really, like, his vanity and his arrogance and his hubris is what does him in, and he never learns from it. And he never, you know, so...
I love the way that fight starts, and that's Superior Spider-Man just running his mouth to Pete, and Pete just punched him straight in the face. Ock's like, he can't believe what just happened, and he's like, okay, it's on, so there's a fight. And one of the notes I had down here was like, I was really surprised. I understand why, but I mean, I was just like, why aren't the rest of the spiders trying to stop this? They need to work together.
Probably when you were younger, you've seen fights that you could have broken up that you didn't, just because you wanted to see how they ended up.
True.
That's what this is.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh shit, no, hold on, let them fight. I want to see what happens with this.
And they're making bets on the side too.
Yeah, like.
Oh, that's great.
That's what I would do.
The other thing I had here, the subplot that kind of gives Pete the opening here. Superior Spider-Man believes that he's facing a past Peter Parker.
Right.
And like, he doesn't want to hurt him because if he does...
It's the only reason he doesn't try to kill him.
Yeah, he's obviously, if I don't want to hurt him because, in other words, I'd jeopardize my own existence. Anyway, yeah, we got some definitely wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff going on with Superior Spider-Man here.
Octavius, you know, Spock in this story is literally, his experience of this story literally takes place in between 2 issues of Superior Spider-Man from, you know, that we saw earlier, you know, years earlier. Wibbly wobbly timey wimey is actually very accurate, very apt to describe that, because if you're not familiar with like shifting timelines and like, you know, compressed timelines and, you know, like the concept of, you know, experiencing a long period of time, like, and then coming back to, you know, minutes after you left to experience that, like, if you don't get that, you ain't gonna get this. Yeah, the last thing is that another arc that I'm glad doesn't get too overplayed, and like 616 Peter, like proper, kind of embraces it after a little bit of uncertainty. He kind of accepts his role that, you know, he's the leader of this whole operation. Octavius kind of fighting him on it, and him realizing that he has to stand against this dude. Otherwise, if this guy ends up in charge, nobody's going to come out of this better than when they came in, is probably a big motivating factor for him to kind of hurry up and decide to take up the mantle of being a leader. So there's that. He has some doubt, but he has, like I said, this is the Spider-Man that I like, that he has uncertainty and he has doubt, but his sense of responsibility and his sense of duty to doing what needs to be done outweighs that. And, you know, he kind of sucks it up. Like, you know, heavy is the head that wears the crown. You know, he doesn't have to like being in charge, but it's necessary to saving the day.
Yeah, he's got to get the job done.
Yeah. There's a saying I've heard from like military people: you want to give the command to the guy that either wants it the least, is willing to accept it, but not too willing, just because you don't want to give too much power to somebody who doesn't understand what it means to have that kind of power.
Yeah, you want them to be cautious.
Yeah.
And make the smart moves.
You want to give it to the person that will utilize it the best, but not necessarily that's not necessarily the person that wants it the most.
That's right.
And that's Peter all over. He's the one that's, you know, gonna do the right thing every time. He won't necessarily like it and he won't necessarily want it, but he'll do it. That comes into play a little bit later. Like we've mentioned, you know, also going back to when we talked about Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut, we talked about Peter's sense of guilt. That's going to come up again.
Yeah.
I'm going to have words about that. I'm not going to like it all that much, but actually no, because we went over part 4, didn't we?
Yeah, that's in here.
Yeah, the mecha, you know, the Japanese, you know, spider mecha.
Yeah.
It's a cool visual and it's a cool moment where he comes and crashes the scene, and he basically amounts to distracting Solus long enough for everybody else to kind of break
Get the hell out.
Yeah. But the mech suit gets smashed. At the time, Peter thinks that, the guy that Takuya, who is the Spider-Man of that universe, he at the time thinks that he was killed by Solus. He doesn't know. Eventually, later on, we find out he made it out alive.
Yep.
When Peter's guilt rears its ugly head, and once again we hear, that I wrote it down. I wrote every important quote in my notes, and I wrote in red ink Peter saying in this issue when that happens, "This is all my fault," with a big angry frowny face next to it, because I hate that, because it's overplayed and it's overused. Like Peter's, especially like under Slott, like this is one thing that really rubs me the wrong way about the way Slott writes Peter. Like he writes that it's all my fault thing like it's a catchphrase. Like Peter has guilt issues. We want our characters to move forward, and when we continue to see repeats of that emotional stumbling block, I can understand it's there. I mean, everybody's got some type of guilt, but to continue to remind us over and over that he feels guilty for something that's happening, blames himself. Yeah, it just feels like we're not getting anywhere. Kind of lost in all of this is what's going on with Spider-Woman with Jessica Drew. This is 616 Jessica Drew. There's two different Jessica Drews running around in this story.
Makes fun writing a synopsis out, trust me.
I know. Yeah. Long story short, one of them is from the main 616 universe. This is Jessica Drew that has been around since I think the 70s. Spider-Woman, the red and yellow costume with the web wings, who was in the Avengers. Sometimes, good character, better cosplay. And there's another Jessica Drew who is in the Ultimate Universe, who was actually a clone female, like a female clone of Peter Parker, who I guess eventually joined S.H.I.E.L.D. and became the Ultimate Universe's Black Widow.
Guess so.
She had a really cool arc in Ultimate Spider-Man. I actually really liked her in Ultimate Spider-Man. I actually liked her costume in Ultimate Spider-Man a lot better than the Black Widow costume they put her in Scarlet Spiders. But that's just me splitting hairs about art again. Spider-Woman, the 3 issues of Spider-Woman that tie into Spider-Verse, they're probably the worst tie-in issues in my opinion.
I might agree.
Yeah, one, because there's not a whole lot of bearing on the plot until the end. There's 3 issues. By the way, in my notes, I marked down each tie-in issue and each main issue. I put like a little highlighter mark, and each color corresponds to a different level of relevance to the main story.
Okay.
That just helps me keep it straight. Yeah, Spider-Woman was not high on that relevancy.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I think at one point, if you're going by the checklist, there's an issue of Amazing Spider-Man. It might be coming up. I don't know. But there's an issue of Amazing Spider-Man where you learn a lot of what happened in the Spider-Woman book. And then when you get to the Spider-Woman book, it's like half the book. You've already, it almost feels like I've read everything here.
I know exactly which one you're talking about. It's towards the end, actually.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. I know exactly which one you're talking about. Ironically, that's the issue that has the most relevancy on the main plot, is the one that they rehashed in the main plot. So
yeah, most of it is just them trying to track down Silk. Spider-Man Noir ends up getting knocked on the head, and they're like, well, let's drop him off at his own home. And then I think Spider-Gwen gets involved, and she's just kind of like hanging out on Loom World, taking the spot of her doppelganger.
Try to throw in so much stuff that's like in any other series would have been pretty awesome. They throw in pirates, and they
Pirate Namor. That's supposedly Namor, and I'm like, I didn't even catch that. Yeah, at the very end, it's mentioned that that's Namor, not mentioned any time in the beginning.
Okay, well, you got one up on me on that.
I had no idea until that we got
soaring over my head.
I was right there with you until that reveal at the very end. I guess, and they just casually mentioned it too.
I guess I'm checked out by that point, man. I don't know. Dennis Hopeless wrote the 3 issues of Spider-Woman. I've heard, I know some people are fans of his. I'm sure there are better series that he's written. This one, it was done no favors that you start a series having to tie into something like some other huge crossover. So, I don't give him too much a hard time for that. What I will give a hard time for is the artwork. Spider-Woman was drawn by Greg Land.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I'm not a fan of for multiple reasons.
I don't know much about the guy, so
I'll send you videos and some links to some things.
Okay, all right.
I won't get into it too much over here because it's just a long story that doesn't deserve getting into. I'm not a big fan of Greg Land's artwork. He has a reputation for tracing artwork and tracing photography from dubious sources. That's all I'll say about that for now.
Okay.
I will elaborate on that in private, but anybody who's listening to this, many who are listening to this probably know what I'm talking about. At the very, very least, his drawings of women tend to be really samey from my taste. Like all of his women tend to look way too much alike. He's not the worst storyteller in the world, but they come better. And sometimes the facial expressions he draws are just really not terribly appropriate to the story, to what the story's trying to get across. They just look kind of generic. And, depending on who you ask, that can also be chalked up to the tracing. I'm just saying, this is just my opinion on that. Feel free to disagree. But dude's artwork is not really my cup of tea.
Okay.
At the end of the day. So that made it a little bit harder to get through the Spider-Woman series. It didn't help that, like I said, a lot of this stuff just had no point, no relation to, moving the main story across.
I think the big thing that we get out of there is the scrolls are ported to Peter, which I mean, that helps elaborate on the prophecy.
Which also gets retreaded elsewhere.
Yeah. Yep.
The other thing is that we find out, Moreland has a libido and he has a type, which I could go my whole life not knowing. There's this whole alternate universe Jessica drew in the Inheritor universe that was a handmaiden to Moreland, who I guess had it going on. And I'm like, not in this series, bro. You're not taking my interest with this. Let's move on. This is not the time or the place.
Don't need it.
If this was something else, this was a different series, I might be down to learn about this, but not now. So, yeah.
Wrap this sucker up. So here we go. Amazing Spider-Man Amazing Spider-Man number 13 and 14, parts 5 and 6 to the Spider-Verse storyline here. Part 5, issue 13, art by Giuseppe Camuncoli, and then art by Olivier Coipel for the 6th part on issue 14. So here we go. The Inheritors are trying to discern what they should do next, as so far they have been unable to squash the army of spiders that plague them. Now, thanks to the work of the Scarlet Spiders, Ben Reilly, Kane Parker, and Jessica Drew, the Inheritors have lost their ability to clone their bodies. However, they take comfort in the fact they have been able to capture the Scion, which is a very important part of their prophecy. Remember, that's baby Benny or Benji. Back at the bunker, Uncle Ben tells the story of how he was bitten by the spider, giving him the Spider-Man powers. But after his wife and nephew were killed by that world's Green Goblin,
the Emerald Elf. Whose idea was that? God.
The Emerald Elf. So when his wife and nephew were killed by the Emerald Elf, Ben quit being a superhero. The world was then laid to waste due to one of Doc Ock's schemes. So let's stop real quick. I mean, give me your thoughts on Ben here. What he's gone through, what he's gone through, and where he's at.
Yeah, I like where this went. I like the backstory of how he came to be, in the Fallout shelter and all that. And it ends up being a very big focal point of the Spider-Girl story that the Spider-Girl team reunite to tell. If nothing else, that came out of it, which is great. But also, I absolutely love the idea. Like, I forgot about this part. When I reread it, I remember the part about, the dimension where, everything was destroyed by, nuclear war. I forgot that Otto Octavius caused it.
Oh,
I
yeah.
was like, that's great. That's fantastic. Because then, Ock in Peter's body has to listen to this and is like,
exactly.
It's like, really? Wait, what? Ben tells it in the story that he's telling. He explicitly says, he's like, Octavius was a genius. He was brilliant, but he was also arrogant. He was also, a megalomaniac, and he didn't understand that his experiment went too far and that he couldn't control it once it went too far. Also, you would think that this would influence Octavius in a positive way. It turns out later on it doesn't. If anything, it pushes him even farther to do more extreme things that he may not have otherwise done, which is, once again, like, that's Octavius. He's a supervillain. You know, he's not going to have the most healthy responses to, you know, this sort of thing. Yeah, it's a sad story that he tells. He ends up going to the same science exhibition as Peter. He ends up getting bitten by the spider instead. This is what I love. Like, I love seeing stuff like this because, you know, it's alluded to in other stories. Like, he says, I tried to do what a good man would do who has these powers, and it ends up not working out for him. He loses his wife and Peter. I can't remember specifically if Ezekiel pops up and offers him the same deal he offered Peter and he offered Silk. Yeah, he finds himself in the same shelter, in the same bomb shelter, as all of this destruction happens around him, and he kind of contemplates, like, you know, maybe I could have stopped Doc, maybe I would have just made it worse. It's really relatable.
If you set Peter and this world's Ben side by side, if you look at them emotionally and what drives them, is obviously you're going to say, well, it's practically the same thing. It's interesting that this world's Spider-Man, Ben Parker, he quit. He was so overwhelmed with what happened to him that, again, you mentioned it earlier, Dan Slott with the guilt. Ben Parker, that's the one thing that causes him to stop being Spider-Man. He feels so guilty for what happened to his family. He said, I can't do this anymore. Of course, that resulted in some horrific things happening to that world because he probably wasn't Spider-Man at the time. But it's interesting when you think about the great power comes great responsibility. That is a central focus of the character of Spider-Man. That responsibility, it's not just great power comes great responsibility, thumbs up. I mean, there is a lot of downside to that. You feel responsible for the good things that happen, and you feel responsible for the bad things that happen, and that can weigh on somebody. And in this case, it weighed on Ben Parker enough to where he said, I'm not doing it anymore, and like I said, bad things happen.
It is at this point that I would like to thank you for giving me an opportunity to transition into the story, into talking a little bit more about that DeFalco, Ron Friends, Spider-Girl story.
Yeah.
It takes place very shortly after this little exchange where Ben tells his story. I wrote down the quote that Ben tells Mayday Parker during that story, where they're just arguing back and forth, and even in the actual part 4 of Spider-Verse, Mayday Parker is just not having it whatsoever. Like, she tells him in no uncertain terms, you copped out, you quit, you gave up, you shirked your responsibilities, and the entire world suffered because of it. And now look at what happened because you didn't do something when you could have. And he says, like, you know, I don't know about Peter in your universe, but the Peter in my universe would have been ashamed of you. Like, really, like, cutting, harsh stuff.
Yeah, she ain't holding back, dude.
Yeah, that continues into the the side story that happens in Spider-Verse team up number 3. Mayday Parker basically resolves she's like, I'm gonna go into the Loom world, and I'm going to rescue my brother, and if nobody else is gonna come with me, give me a transporter and I'll go myself, I don't care. Ben Parker tries to talk her out of it and tries to kind of counsel her, and it doesn't really work. There was one quote that I read here that I was like, I have to write this down because I haven't heard this quote. I haven't heard this play on words used in quite this way, I don't think, ever. Once again, you get Tom DeFalco. You get somebody like Tom DeFalco writing this and writing it in the framework of characters that he's familiar with. And, he basically created Mayday Parker. So
yeah,
he's in his wheelhouse, and it hit me hard, man. What Ben Parker tells her is, because she recites cites, the old classic Spider-Man idiom, with great power comes great responsibility. Mm-hmm. And he corrects her with the actual quote that Stan Lee actually wrote in Amazing Fantasy 15. With great power, there must also come great responsibility, which is how Stan wrote it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anybody ever gives too much thought to the difference between those, the way those two things are worded. But Tom DeFalco actually did, and he actually put it into words, and it hit me hard, man. It hit me harder than I expected. He says, a subtle but profound difference. There's no guaranteed link between power and responsibility. Too many focus on the former without any regard for the latter. That's something you only get out of, one, a good writer, somebody who's a good writer in the first place, and two, somebody who studied, who knows his Spider-Man. And Tom DeFalco was he used to be editor-in-chief at Marvel. He's written a lot of Spider-Man. He knows his stuff. So that was the only thing I wish is that I actually kind of wish that had more of an effect on May in the story. It kind of doesn't, but it's such a good line. It's such a good moment where he actually kind of deconstructs that phrase, and it's like, yes, with great power does not automatically come great responsibility. That's the whole reason why Spider-Man became Spider-Man, because he gained great power and he squandered it. The great responsibility only came after tragedy.
That's right.
The way Stan wrote, and I'm sure Stan didn't intend this the way he wrote it, but the way he wrote it was open enough to interpretation for other people to pick up the thread. And with great power there must also come great responsibility. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily automatically. Sometimes you kind of have to work for it. You kind of have to work. That's Peter's whole thing too, is that throughout his history he had to work at being a good person. It didn't always come natural. I've mentioned this in other times before. That's what makes Spider-Man so relatable, is that sometimes he's kind of a douchebag. Like if he doesn't kind of correct himself and kind of he has to work at being a good person sometimes. Sometimes it's harder to do that than others. That's an important thing to remember. Yeah. And it's central to every Spider-Man story, including this one. Some writers lose sight of that too. When you say too many focus on the former without any regard for the latter, that can go for the people that are writing the character just as much as the characters themselves.
Hey, it's plug time, and you all know what that means. This would be a good time to plug the sponsor of the W2M network, and that is Grammarly. For you, the listeners of Source Material, Grammarly is offering a free download of the Grammarly software. Grammarly's AI-powered products help people communicate more effectively. Grammarly helps you write mistake-free on Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and nearly anywhere else you write on the web. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. To download Grammarly today, go to getgrammarly.com/W2M-network. Again, that's getgrammarly.com/W2M-network to download Grammarly for free. That is going to be the end of this installment of Source Material's coverage of Spider-Verse. As far as plugs go, Benjamin J. Cologne can be found at Epic Benjamin J on Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Make sure to keep an eye out for his Sketchbook Saturday posts featuring some of his amazing art. You can find Source Material on Facebook at Source Material Podcast and on Twitter at SourceMattCast. To put it simply, we're kind of like a book club for comics. I also do a podcast called Unspoken Issues that talks 90s comics in association with the UnspokenDecade.com. And of course, make sure to check out the Rattleitchen Broadcasting Network on Facebook and Twitter to stay in the loop on all the shows coming up this week. We've got something dropping daily, so there is never a lack of content. Appreciation also goes out to W2Mnet.com for hosting the show. And with that being said, make sure to watch out for the next part of Source Material's discussion on Marvel's Spider-Verse.